I've always preferred the swamps to the mountains. There's something honest about the muck. It doesn't pretend to be majestic, it just is. But after what happened last October at Blackwater Creek, I realized that some things stay in the muck for a reason. I was solo kayaking through a remote tributary of the Atchafalaya Basin. My plan was to camp on a hammock, a small patch of dry land rising out of the stagnant water. I found one just before sunset. It was a miserable little island with one dead cypress tree standing in the center like a gallows. The water in the creek was different that day. It wasn't brown, it was oil-slick black, and it didn't ripple. It looked like solid glass. As I set up my small hammock tent between the cypress and a sturdy tupelo, I noticed the silence. No bullfrogs, no cicadas, just the sound of my own breathing. I ate a cold meal, wanting to avoid a fire that would attract the swarms of mosquitoes I expected. But the mosquitoes never came. Even the insects seemed to be avoiding that island. I climbed into my hammock, suspended 5 feet above the black water, and drifted into a restless sleep. I woke up at midnight to the sound of something breaking the surface. Plop, plop. It sounded like large stones being dropped into the water, one by one, in a perfect circle around my camp. I turned on my headlamp and peered over the edge of my hammock. The light hit the water, but it didn't penetrate. It just reflected off that obsidian surface. The stones weren't stones at all. They were heads, dozens of them. They looked like human skulls, but they were covered in a thick, translucent film, like a layer of jellyfish slime. They were bobbing in the water, their empty eye sockets fixed on me. They weren't floating, they were rising out of the mud on long, leathery necks that looked like rotted kelp. I froze. I was suspended right above them. If I fell, I'd land in a nest of them. Then, the dead cypress tree behind me began to vibrate. I felt the hum through the ropes of my hammock. From the hollow of the tree, a hand emerged. It was huge, gray, and dripping with black slime. It didn't have fingers. It had 5 long, suckered tentacles that began to feel along the ropes, searching for the knot. It was untying me. I grabbed my machete from the side pocket. As the first rope gave way and my hammock tilted sharply toward the water, I swung. The machete bit into the gray limb and a thick, black fluid hissed out, smelling like a dead sea. The hand retracted with a sound like a wet lung collapsing. I tumbled out of the hammock, landing on the muddy edge of the island. The heads in the water began to move toward the shore. They didn't have bodies, just those long, pulsing necks connected to something massive beneath the surface. I lunged for my kayak. It was half filled with that same black slime. I didn't care. I pushed it into the water and jumped in, paddling with a desperation I didn't know I possessed. Every time my paddle dipped into the water, I felt it hit something soft and rubbery. The heads were under me now, bumping against the bottom of the thin plastic hull. Thump, thump, thump. A voice rose from the water. It didn't sound like a person. It sounded like air bubbles bursting in mud. "Stay. It's so cold. Stay and be the skin." I didn't look back until I reached the main channel 3 hours later. My hands were blistered and my kayak was stained with that foul, black grease. When I finally reached the boat ramp and hauled my kayak onto the grass, I saw it. Stuck to the very back of the boat was a piece of skin. It was perfectly rectangular, about the size of a human back, and it was covered in my own tattoos I had on my shoulders. I checked my back in the rearview mirror. My skin was there, untouched. But when I touched the area where the tattoos were, I felt nothing. No sensation, no pain, just a cold, numb patch of gray, slimy flesh. I never went back to the basin. Sometimes, at night, when I'm in the shower, the water feels a little too heavy, and when I look at the drain, I see a single bubble of black slime rising up, whispering in a voice that sounds just like mine. We're still wearing it. We're still wearing you. My brother used to say that in the mountains, it's not a bear or a fall from a cliff that kills you, it's your own imagination. After that night, I know he was wrong. Sometimes what you imagine is far more merciful than the reality. I had set out for the Blackwood National Forest. I just wanted 3 days of peace away from work, my phone, and people. I found a spot about 10 kilometers from the nearest trail, a small clearing by a dry creek bed surrounded by pines so thick that it felt like twilight even at noon. The first night was quiet, just the crackling of the fire and the sighing of the wind. But on the second night, everything changed. I was sitting by the dying embers, finishing my dinner, when I heard it. Snap. The sound of a heavy footstep on dry needles. It came from about 20 meters behind my tent. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth. You hear noises in the woods all the time, but this had a rhythm. 2 steps, a pause, 2 more steps. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded thin and out of place in that silence. No answer, just a silence that was far too deep. The crickets had stopped chirping. That's always a bad sign in the woods. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. The beam sliced through the darkness, but I saw only trunks and their long, dancing shadows. Nothing more. I went to bed with a heavy feeling, my camping axe laid right next to my sleeping bag. I didn't fall asleep until dawn, but it wasn't for long. I was woken up by the sound of a zipper. It wasn't the zipper on my sleeping bag, it was the zipper of my tent. Someone, or something, was opening it from the outside, slowly, millimeter by millimeter. I heard that soft zzzt repeating at regular intervals. I held my breath. My heart was hammering so hard I was afraid whoever was out there could hear it through the tent wall. I watched the top of the entrance. The slider was slowly moving down. A gap opened and cold night air began to bleed into the tent. Then it stopped. The gap was about 10 centimeters wide. I expected a hand to reach in or to see an eye peering through, but nothing happened. After 5 minutes that felt like hours, I summoned my courage. I grabbed the axe, unzipped the rest of the way, and lunged outside with a roar meant to mask my own terror. There was no one there. The fire was nothing but a pile of gray ash. Moonlight hit the clearing, making everything look like a black and white film. I walked around the tent, not a single footprint. Then I looked at my backpack, which I had left leaning against a tree by the fire pit. It was open. All my belongings were neatly laid out on the ground. My clothes, my mess kit, my first aid kit, everything was arranged in perfect rows, as if done by someone with obsessive-compulsive disorder. But one thing was missing: my boots. I started to panic. My socks soaked through instantly from the dew. I looked around and saw them. They were standing about 5 meters from the fire, their toes pointed directly toward the dark forest. I walked over to them, but as I leaned down to pick them up, I noticed something on the tree trunk directly above them. A small, carved figure made of bark was nailed there. It looked like a human with unnaturally long arms, and tied to that figure was a lock of my own hair. The same lock that had been bothering my eyes the night before, which I thought I had just absent-mindedly pulled out myself. In that moment, I heard a laugh. It wasn't a human laugh. It sounded like 2 dry branches grinding together, trying to mimic human amusement. It was coming from directly above me. I looked up into the canopy of the pines. About 10 meters up, I saw a figure. It was incredibly thin, almost as if it were fused with the trunk. It was wearing my t-shirt, the one from my backpack, and its hands were clutching my camera. The flash of the camera blinded me for a second. Click. I didn't waste another moment. I didn't take the tent, I didn't take the backpack. I just shoved my feet into my boots, grabbed my axe, and ran. I ran toward the car, ignoring the branches whipping my face and the stones twisting my ankles. Behind me, the whole time, I heard that snapping wood sound and that imitated laughter. Whatever it was, it didn't want to catch me. It wanted to hunt me. It wanted to see my fear. I reached the car at daybreak. My hands were shaking so hard it took 5 tries to get the key into the ignition. As I pulled off the forest road onto the asphalt, I looked in the rearview mirror. A figure was standing at the edge of the woods. It was wearing my t-shirt and holding my camera. It reached up and raised the camera with a distorted grin, as if taking one last photo of me. When I got home, I realized one more item was missing from my bag: my journal. The next day, I got a notification from my cloud storage. My camera had briefly connected to Wi-Fi before being destroyed. There was only one new photo. It was me, sleeping in the tent, taken through that 10-centimeter gap in the zipper. And right next to my head, just inches from my face, was a gray, elongated hand, gently stroking my hair. I've always been a solo hiker. There's a specific kind of clarity you find when it's just you and the trail. But after what happened at Dead Man's Pass, I can't even look at a mountain without feeling a cold, oily shiver run down my spine. I was scouting a new route in the northern Cascades. My goal was a high-altitude plateau known locally as the Whispering Cliffs. The name, I assumed, came from the wind whistling through the limestone caves. I arrived at the base of the cliffs just as the sun was dipping below the peaks, painting the world in violent oranges and deep, bruised purples. I pitched my tent on a flat ledge about 50 feet above the valley floor. It was a perfect spot, defensible, dry, and with a view that would make any photographer weep. But as the darkness set in, the whispering started. It wasn't the wind. Wind has a whistle, a howl, or a moan. This was a dry, frantic muttering. It sounded like 1,000 people talking in a low hum just out of earshot. I sat by my stove, trying to ignore it, focusing on the blue flame of the burner. Help him. No. Closer. Help him. I snapped my head toward the darkness. My flashlight beam hit the gray rock walls. Nothing, just shadows. I told myself it was auditory pareidolia, the brain trying to find patterns in random noise. I crawled into my sleeping bag and jammed earplugs into my ears. I woke up at 3 a.m., not because of a sound, but because of a sensation. My tent was moving. It wasn't shaking from the wind, it was being dragged. I sat up, my heart thundering. The earplugs were still in, but I could feel the vibration of the gravel under my floor. I grabbed my knife and slashed a small hole in the rear mesh to see what was behind me. In the dim starlight, I saw a dozen thin, pale shapes. They looked like humans, but their limbs were too long, their skin the color of wet limestone. They weren't using their hands to pull the tent. They were using their teeth, biting into the fabric and the guy lines, dragging me slowly toward the edge of the cliff. I didn't scream. I knew if I screamed, they would know I was awake. I reached for my bear spray, but it was gone. They had unzipped the outer vestibule and taken only my defense tools. One of the creatures put its face against the mesh. It had no eyes, just smooth, pale skin where the sockets should be, and a mouth filled with needle-thin teeth. It began to whisper, and this time it was right against my ear. "Don't be afraid. We just want to see the view with you." The voice didn't come from its mouth. It came from the rock itself. I didn't wait. I didn't grab my boots. I lunged out of the front zip, tumbling onto the sharp rocks. The creatures hissed, a sound like steam escaping a pipe, and vanished into the crevices of the cliff with impossible speed. I looked at the edge. My tent was now only inches away from a 200-foot drop. I scrambled toward the descent path, my bare feet bleeding on the shale. But the whispers followed me. They weren't behind me anymore, they were in front of me. Every time I reached a switchback, I would see one of those pale things standing in the middle of the trail, miming the actions of a person, brushing its teeth with a bone or pretending to read a map made of dried skin. They weren't trying to kill me, not yet. They were playing with me. They were waiting for me to get tired. I spent the next 4 hours descending in a fever dream of terror. I fell, I crawled, and I felt their cold, wet fingers brush against my ankles every time I slowed down. They whispered my name. They whispered my mother's name. They knew things they couldn't possibly know. I reached my truck at the trailhead just as the first gray light of dawn broke. I didn't even look back. I drove until I hit a town with a 24-hour diner. I sat there, shivering in a booth, covered in blood and dirt. The waitress brought me coffee and looked at me with pity. "Rough night in the woods, honey?" I nodded, unable to speak. I reached into my pocket to find a coin for a payphone, but my fingers touched something cold and sharp. I pulled it out. It was a tooth. A long, needle-thin tooth wrapped in a small scrap of my tent's fabric. And then, from the air vent above my booth, I heard it, a faint, dry muttering. "Found you, found you, found you."